There we go. Now hear me? Hello, testing 1, 2. There we go. All right. Well, I should have included a slide about this, but let it slip my mind. If you need a reminder, hopefully you don't. Today is Valentine's Day. Okay. Hopefully that's not the first you're hearing of it. Don't wait until after you get off work to go to the store to get chocolate and roses, because they will be gone and you will be in trouble. But does anybody know anything about Saint Valentine, where we get Valentine's Day from? Probably not. So he was a priest in Rome, somewhere in the 3rd century. And we actually don't know a lot about him, because there are multiple accounts of different Valentines around this time. So it's kind of like he's a little bit of a mythological figure in history. But there's a story that he was imprisoned, and he's called to the judge's house. And the judge tells him, if you can heal my daughter, who is blind, I'll let you go. I'll do whatever you ask me. So he puts his hands on the daughter's eyes and cures her of her blindness. She's able to see. So he tells him to take down all of the idols that he has around the judge's house and worship God. And the judge does this, and then Valentine is released to go free. But then, of course, he is arrested again later on down the line, under the rule of Claudius, who was called Claudius the Cruel, because Claudius was having trouble recruiting men to be in his army, to strengthen his army, and because men were too attached to their wives and their families. So they didn't want to go and join the army and go and fight and risk their lives. So he outlawed marriage. He didn't want men to be able to get married. But Valentine, supposedly, according to tradition and story, still secretly helped Christians get married and helped young couples join together. And so, of course, this was found out, and he was arrested and eventually put to death. So he's considered a martyr. There's another account of someone in Africa named Valentine, also a priest that was martyred. So there's all of the Valentines were martyred for some reason in the 3rd century. But there's your trivia fact for the day, in case anybody asks you why we have Valentine's Day. But this week we're still in 1 Corinthians, moving on to chapter 3. And we'll be finishing our series this Sunday of They Told Me There Will Be No Math. But before we get started, I have a question for you to think about, respond to if you'd like. What's the purpose of church? Why are we here? Why do we come together in Bible study every week? Why do we gather on Sunday mornings for worship? What's the point? Feel free to volunteer. Any answers?
2 or more gathered.
Community, yeah. Wherever 2 or more gathered, God is there also, right? Body of Christ. Good for us to be gathered together, right? We're trying to grow in our faith together. We're trying to make disciples. Is it, it's about us partially, but it's also about our community, about the world around us, about the work that we're trying to do in the world, right?
I think it provides an opportunity for service.
An opportunity for service. Absolutely. If we're doing it right, it does. So last week, David, we can continue to think about that question as we go through the presentation this morning. But last week, David talked about the city of Corinth and where it's located, what it would have been like in Paul's day. So just in case you weren't here, or just to recap, refresh your brains, right? It's a double port city. So it's between two different bodies of water where people would have come together. Sailors that would have been at sea for months at a time would come here and be on land for the first time in a long time. And we know what it's like to be in a sailor's town, right? So you could think of it as Sin City, maybe an ancient version of Bourbon Street, or a more rough and rowdy Las Vegas, right? The whole city was just taken over with people that were associated with or with shipping and sailing. But like any kind of city, big city, there was many places of worship. So I was in Charleston for a few days last week, and Kylie and I were just walking around the city. And Charleston, I mean, it's a decent city, but it's not a big city. But to see the number of churches that are everywhere in that city was kind of surprising, right? And part of it is because it was and is a port city, right? It's one of the first ports in America, or was, and because of that, you had all kinds of immigrants there that brought their own religions with them and had their own houses of worship. So this is a wild place. You remember the temple of Aphrodite that sat up above the city, that was the largest brothel in the world, that was devoted to Aphrodite. So this is a wild place, not somewhere that you'd want to raise a family, and probably a really weird place to try and start a church and do ministry. But that's exactly what Paul did, right? He spent 18 months living in this city, getting to know the people, embedding himself in the community, and investing himself in the people there to start a church and start to teach them about Jesus and the ways of our faith, and continue to help them grow in faith and change the way that they lived. So this week we're in 1 Corinthians chapter 3. We'll be in verses 1 through 9. So Paul is kind of moved from talking about we must be united. You have to, live in the ways of the cross. The cross is foolishness to those who are in the world, but it makes perfect sense to people of faith. And he starts to address some of the Corinthians' complaints, some of their disputes. And we're again going to be in the Message version this week. So he says, "But for right now, friends, I'm completely frustrated by your unspiritual dealings with each other and with God. You're acting like infants in relation to Christ, capable of nothing more than nursing at the breast. Well then, I'll nurse you since you don't seem capable of anything more. As long as you grab for what makes you feel good or makes you look important, are you really much different than a babe at the breast, content only when everything's going your way? When one of you says, 'I'm on Paul's side,' and another says, 'I'm for Apollos,' aren't you being totally childish?" How would you feel if one of your pastors got up on Sunday morning and addressed you this way? Or if Phil wrote you an email about some kind of disagreement that you had during the week and compared you to an infant that's capable of nothing more than nursing at the breast? Probably be pretty upset, right? But so this isn't a new insult. It's not something that he's making up or a unique kind of metaphor. This would have been a very common comparison or metaphor that was used in philosophical and religious instruction. And this is something that Paul was trained in, was very educated. So it would have been a natural kind of understanding of what he's saying. So this church exists only because of Paul, because of his ministry. And the people are now upset with him. Before Paul got there, they likely knew nothing of Jesus. They probably knew nothing of Hebrew scriptures, nothing of God. And Paul spent time with them, invested them, trying to teach them about the faith. So reading this passage, seeing how Paul is addressing them, it would appear that they are fighting about things that just don't matter, right? They're just kind of squabbling with one another, and they may have been fighting about the color of the carpet. I know churches don't really do that or anything, right? It's an old problem. But it's also, I think, maybe we should give them the benefit of the doubt or cut them a little bit of slack, because they didn't just have their Bibles that they could go home and read every day. They didn't have hundreds or thousands of years of religious tradition to draw on to help them make decisions and figure out how to encounter what to do when they encountered new problems. All they knew were the things that Paul taught them and the things that he said in the letters that he wrote to them, right? They're living in Sin City around all of these sailors, people from all over the world that have all kinds of traditions. There's the temple of Aphrodite there in the city up on the hillside, and they're trying to live in a completely different way from the rest of the community around them. Do something that's completely unique, completely countercultural to the things that they were taught probably when they were children, the things that they have been taught now that they're adults. They don't have a theologically trained pastor or five there to guide them. They just have Paul and Apollos who write them letters from time to time. So moving on to verse 5, starting in verse 5, Paul says, "Who do you think Paul is anyway? Or Apollos, for that matter? Servants, both of us, servants who waited on you as you gradually learned to entrust your lives to our mutual master. We each carried out our servant assignment. I planted the seed, Apollos watered the plants, but God made you grow. It's not the one who plants or the one who waters who is at the center of this process, but God, who makes things grow. Planting and watering are menial servant jobs at minimum wages. What makes them worth doing is the God we are serving. You happen to be God's field in which we are working." So it appears that one of the ways that the Corinthians are dividing themselves is based off of the leader that they're following. So apparently some of them were saying that Apollos must be the true teacher. He's the most right. And so we're going to follow him, and that makes us righteous and holy. But then there were another faction that was saying that, well, no, Paul said this, and I agree with this, so this must be right. And that makes us holy, right? Something along those lines, I would have to imagine. But Paul is not having any of that. He's saying, me and Apollos are not at odds. We're not fighting each other. We're not battling each other for converts. We are doing the same mission. We have different parts of this work. Our missions, our callings look differently, but both of us are working in God's fields. We're all tilling the same soil, planting seeds, helping to nurture those seeds as they grow. But it's God that is doing the growing. God is what is growing this movement, helping to grow this church. Right. This is not like in other parts of the New Testament where we see accounts of Paul battling false teachers that are coming in and trying to distract people or steal away or divide churches, right? Paul and Apollos are both doing their best to invest in this community and nurture them as they grow in faith. So we see some familiar problems. The Corinthians apparently have developed a bit of an ego. They've inflated their own sense of knowledge and spiritual maturity and seem to be focused on being right. Right. So that's why before this passage in chapter 2, or apparently that one of the problems that they have, or issues they're bringing up with Paul, is that he has not properly instructed them in wisdom for the future. He hasn't, taught them enough things, that we're smarter than this and you're not giving us enough information. And so Paul, that's why he starts off comparing them to infants, because he's kind of knocking them back down to size. Oh, you think you're so smart. So we see sometimes that movements or organizations, they can become more about a specific leader than they are about the movement or a specific mission, right? Sometimes there's a movement that starts and they have certain tenets and certain beliefs, a very specific mission that all of the people have worked towards achieving that mission, making that mission and those goals happen. But then there's a leader that comes along and people kind of drift towards the leader instead of the mission, right? It doesn't really matter what our mission is or what our goals are. It's just whatever the leader says goes. I see this happen a lot now, especially on social media, right? There's people that have a big following, or even especially a lot in our political leaders, right? It doesn't matter what the goals are or what our beliefs are. If we have a leader that we like, then, well, it's okay. They said it's right, so that must be right. It makes me think about, when I was a kid and I would get in trouble, I would say, well, but so-and-so was doing it. And my parents would say, I don't care what so-and-so is doing. I care what you were doing. That's not right, right? I'm sure all of you have told your kids various versions of that thing. But then when we get adults, right, and something happens and we say, well, but what about so-and-so? They were doing such and such and such. And we kind of forget the principles that we have instilled in our children, right? And I see this especially in political leaders, no matter which side of the aisle you fall on. There's always a lot of but what about isms that are used to justify a switch in policy or justifying something that should not have been done. You can think of your own examples, wade into those waters. But it becomes acceptable to just do whatever it takes to win, right? You lose your morals, you lose whatever convictions you had because you just want to win and be able to get your way because you think you're right. The way that you want things to go is the right way. And so you're going to do whatever you have to do, squash whoever you have to squash, compromise whatever morals you have to make sure that you can do the right thing. Right? So this happens when we start to inflate our own egos, to make things more about ourselves, how smart we are, how talented and gifted we are. When we think we are more right or more faithful or more holy, we can start to drift away from the things that hold us, that keep us grounded and keep us centered. But part of what is happening in 1 Corinthians, right, is Paul is arguing with them about community. It's not just about being right or how smart you think you are. It's how you are living together in this church and in the city that you are living in, right? Over and over, Jesus and Paul call us to live in community with one another. They don't tell us to go off and live in a cave all by ourselves and only sit and pray all day. They tell us to go out and care for the poor and the needy, to clothe the naked, to care for the sick, to make sure that everyone around us is cared for. And that sounds really nice and lovely, and it makes us feel all warm and fuzzy inside. But when we actually start doing it, it's really, really hard, right? We've all experienced that. It's really complicated. The world is not simple, and it seems like it only gets more and more complicated. Especially as technology increases, there are more people in the world, there are new problems. It seems like there are more ways that we could become vulnerable, more ways that people could take advantage of us. And so our tendency as human beings, myself included, is to try and protect ourselves, to try and protect our families, our communities, our ways of life, our organizations. And so when we do that, sometimes we have a tendency to start blaming others people, right? Blaming other, we find a scapegoat, a reason that this is happening. Well, it's because of those people. Or, if those people would just make better decisions, then they wouldn't be in this situation. So one of my favorite authors, I've talked about him before, Father Greg Boyle. He has a gang ministry out in Los Angeles. And one of my favorite quotes of his is that we should seek a compassion that can stand in awe of what the poor have to carry, rather than stand in judgment at how they carry it. Right? I'll say that again. We should seek a compassion that can stand in awe at what the poor have to carry, rather than stand in judgment of how they carry it. So when we don't know someone, when we are at a distance, it's easy to judge people for the decisions they make in their life, right? But it's hard to hate someone up close, because you learn about the things that they've been through in their life. You see all of the complexity of their life, the things that they're dealing with, all of the different battles that they're trying to fight at one time. And it's a little easier to understand why people make the decisions that they make when you actually know them and have a connection to them. It's not just as simple as making everybody live like us, which, if everybody did that, then the world would be fine. Sometimes we get upset with people for making bad choices, because people make bad choices, but we don't realize that sometimes people don't have good choices to make. They're left with a bad choice or a worse choice. So I did you've probably heard me talk about circles before as well, an organization I worked with in college. And they work with people that are living in poverty to help them break cycles of poverty. So there was this one woman that was coming to Circles. She had a part-time job. She had 3 kids. They lived in public housing, and she was a single mom. The kids were very involved in their school. They had after-school activities. They played sports. They were doing well in school. Her job, they loved her. They wanted her to come on full-time, to be a full-time employee. She had benefits, which sounds like a wonderful thing, right? She's taking a step, starting to, dig herself out of this hole. But she continually turned her job down and said, no, I'm not going to take that job. I'm going to stay part-time, stay just where I am, continue to live in public housing. And it got to the point where her employer was contacting people at Circles, because they knew that she was involved there, part of that community, and saying, we need you to help us get her to come on full-time, because they loved her that much. The people at Circles could not understand why she wasn't taking this job, because it doesn't make sense, right? I think we can all agree that. But what they found out is that if she were to take that full-time job, she would immediately lose all of the assistance that she received, right? So she'd have to her rent would skyrocket. She would be working all the time to try and make up for all of this. So she wouldn't be at home in the afternoons to help her children with their homework. Her kids wouldn't be able to do all of those after-school activities that they were involved in. So she would work all the time, and her kids would be at home all by themselves to do whatever they wanted to, because they would most likely be unsupervised, right? So her life wouldn't get any better. It would actually get worse. And it would mostly get worse for her children, who would not have the loving guidance of their mother there every day in their life anymore. So that's why, and not to mention, her spending power would also decrease, which would add to her issues, right? So when we understand all of that information, it's a little easier to understand why she was continuing to stay put in that situation, instead of do what the logical thing for us to do, which was take the full-time job, continue to work harder, climb the ladder, all these sorts of things, right? So with the people in Circles in that community, they were able to help get her enrolled in college courses so that she could better herself and get more training, so that once her kids were out of the house, left to go to school or start their own careers, that she would have more education and be able to get a better job, to take care of herself, right? So we can win arguments. We can fight to make things the way that we think they should be. We can, inflate our own ego, do things the way we want it to be. But at what cost? If we get our way, why does it matter if it's not actually helping make the world a better place, right? Just winning for the sake of winning to make ourselves feel better, because we think we are more self-righteous or right than everyone else. It's not really the point of our faith, right? I always think about when I hear Christians talk about, trying to get our beliefs enacted in politics or make laws that reflect our own convictions, right? Their accounts of Jesus, he's been teaching, and there's a whole crowd of people that are so invigorated and excited about Jesus. They want to install him as king. So they're gathering people, continuing to start building up this movement. And instead of going with them and trying to start a revolution and take power, Jesus just leaves and walks away. He has no interest in trying to control or have worldly power, because that's not what he was here to do. Instead of starting a revolution, Jesus submitted himself to death on a cross. And I think a lot of times we as Christians forget that part of the story, right? We start to be like the Corinthians and think we know better, we're smarter or more righteous than others, and forget that we're supposed to be living in the pattern of Christ, not fighting for power, but serving others, humbling ourselves, and walking in the ways of Christ. So Phil asked you, I think a couple of weeks ago, what's worth fighting over, right? When Paul is urging us to be united, to be of the same mind, he's not saying that, you should never argue, you should always agree, right? We should argue about things because we all have different perspectives, and sometimes we get things wrong and people need to call us out on it. But it's making sure that we're not arguing over things like the color of the carpet, but we're arguing how we can best meet people's needs and make our communities better. When we lean in, so I talked about community is messy. So to really, in my opinion, right, you can disagree with me if you like, part of our faith is leaning into the mess, right? That's what I loved about circles so much, is that they got all up in people's lives and helped them figure out how to continue to set goals and take steps to make their lives better. So you're going to learn things that you didn't know. My family is a foster family, and they didn't start this until I was starting my senior year of college. But two brothers came. They were 8 months old and 6 years old when they first came to live with my family. And we had no idea what we were getting into. It's just one day they call you and say, hey, we have kids that we're bringing to your house. We'll be here in such and such time. Be ready. And so then social workers show up and they have these two little boys. One, my parents are about to be empty nesters, but instead they ended up starting over with an infant and a 6-year-old. And so the longer they were with us, we learned more and more about the parents, about the boys, their family situation. And at first, we were just upset, right? As any of you would be, about the situation that the parents had put these boys in, the things that they had done, the neglects, all these things, right? They had drug problems, all sorts of stuff. And we were just really angry at them all the time because these two incredible little boys were just being neglected and not nurtured as they should have been. But the more that we spent time and learned about the parents, we learned that they grew up in the same situation. right? They had parents that were had issues with drugs. They grew up in a very rural, poor community where there weren't a lot of opportunities. They didn't have people they can make connections with to help get them out of those situations. They didn't have positive role models that they could see to help, model their lives after. They grew up in the same situation. And it's easy to judge them and say, well, you're adults now, you should know better. But you can't, you may have heard me say this before, you can't be what you haven't seen, right? If all you see is this situation, then that's all you know in the world, and you don't know how to get out of that. We hear all of these stories about, whether it's a famous business leader or a sports famous athlete, right? They grew up in this terrible situation, and somehow they made it out. Well, most of the time, the way they made it out is because a teacher or a coach or a counselor or somebody stepped in and helped pull them out and made a difference. So I hear people all the time, myself included, that we lament the ways of the world, that everything is going to hell in a handbasket. It seems like things are just getting worse. Nothing's getting better all the time. Well, folks, if we want things to get better, at some point we have to be better, right? If we want to change, want the world to change, then we can't continue to live in the ways of the world and fight battles the way that the world fights battles, right? Which is what the Corinthians were doing. They were still trying to live the ways that the rest of their world lived. And Paul's like, that's not how this works. All right. You're not living that way anymore. You have to live in the ways of Christ. And that sounds nice and fluffy, but it's really hard. We have to be connected and invested in the community, in the people that are most in need, if we want to help those people and make a difference in the world. So, for example, we had a night to shine last Friday. I know a lot of you were there. Absolutely incredible event, right? I don't think I've ever experienced so much joy in one place as I did that night. Absolutely beautiful way to celebrate and love on people with special needs. There's already talk about doing it again next year, okay? But what are we going to do for that community of people between now and next year, right? They still need community. They still need to be loved. They still need to be celebrated. It's great to do Night to Shine again next year, but how are we going to build relationships and really get to know and invest in those kinds of people between now and then? So, questions. Think about why you come to church. I don't know if that seems like an obvious question, right? That's why I think a lot of you were just kind of like, why are you asking us this when we started? But it's not something I think that we investigate a lot, is why are you here? Like, when you come to church, what are you looking for? Is it just because you like the music, or your friends go here, or whatever reason? Why do you come to church? What or who is your community? Who are you connected to? Is it your Sunday school class? Is it just people in this church? Is it people in your neighborhood? What kinds of people do you hang out with? Are they all just like you? Do you have people that are different from you? Just think about that for a while. And then think about who is not included or present in your community. Who are you not connected to? How much time do you devote to strengthening your community? Are you invested in trying to make your community a better place, or are you just going to work, hanging out with your family, coming to church on Sundays, Tuesday mornings, and then that's it? What is keeping you from leaning into the mess, from really getting down and dirty, trying to get to know people who aren't like you, trying to go into the mess of other people's lives and help them shoulder their burdens and figure out how we can make this world a better place? discuss.